just turning 13 in 1940, 42. And that's when I was living in Pasadena, California. And at that time, in 1942, the executive order, 9066, came out, where people of Japanese ancestry were to be evacuated. And actually, in Pasadena, there was this relatively small community of Japanese people living there. And we were scheduled to evacuate from Pasadena in May. It was May of 1942. And our destination was to be, we didn't know at the time, but when we left, we were put on a train, and on the train we found out we were going to Tulare, California, which was a assembly center, because the permanent camps were being built, and they had not completed construction by that time. But the temporary location was in Tulare, California, which was a Tulare County fairground, and temporary barracks were built there. And they also utilized the horse stables for apartments. And a similar location that people had gone to was the Santa Anita racetrack. But we were sent to Tulare.
Yeah, no, it's fine. This is.
And that was May of 1942. And there in Tulare, there were about 6,000 people in this temporary camp. And then we were moved from that temporary camp to a permanent camp. And the majority of people from Pasadena that I knew and grew up with were sent to Gila, Arizona, which was one of the permanent camps. But we were sent to Manzanar, which is in California, because my father, prior to the evacuation order, had volunteered. They were looking for volunteers to help construct these camps, and he assumed that we were going to Manzanar, so he volunteered to go there and help build the camp. This is along with other volunteers, and so he was there in Manzanar, and so rather than go to Gila, where most Pasadena people went, we were sent to Manzanar to join him. Now, prior to all this, though, when December 7th occurred, and the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and there's all this chaos, the following day, that was on Sunday, the following Monday, in Pasadena, this is now December 7th, 1941, before we were evacuated, my mother was rounded up and imprisoned And the reason was that she taught a Japanese language school on Saturday. And so she was an alien, and so she was, on Monday when I came home from school, she was sitting in our living room with her coat and hat and purse, and when I came home I saw a police car and another car in front of our house, and at that time when I went into the house she was sitting there, and my sister was there, older sister was there, and there were these plainclothes FBI people going through the house and confiscating whatever they thought was of interest. And she was taken away that day. We didn't know where she was taken to, but it turned out later she was imprisoned at the federal penitentiary in Terminal Island in San Pedro. And we were not allowed to visit. We didn't know where she was. And meanwhile, as I mentioned, my father had volunteered to help construct the camp in Manzanar, and so one of my older sisters was responsible for me and my two brothers. And the evacuation order came out, and so she was responsible for us to be evacuated along with the other people. So I had no father, I had no mother, and my sister was responsible. She was like 19, I think, at the time. Yeah, 19. Anyway, we ended up in Manzanar because my father was there. When we were in Tulare, we were there with May, June, about 3 months. And my mother had been interrogated and imprisoned in the federal penitentiary and then released. And so she joined us in Tulare. And then we all were transferred from Tulare to Manzanar. That's my mother, my two brothers, and my sister. So we went to Manzanar by bus and joined my father there. Now Manzanar was the permanent camp, and it was a camp of 10,000 people, and we arrived there I think it was July of 1942. And my father already had a so-called apartment in one of the barracks, and we lived in block 28, which was near the hospital, because he was now had a job at the hospital. So we were reasonably close to the hospital. But in our block, block 28, there were very few people my age. There was just two other boys and a couple of girls about my age, and very few other younger people. And so it was sort of lonely there without, younger people. So at that time, being 13, my interest is mostly sports and play. Okay? And so we soon found other companions our age in another block. And my friend and I would go down there and spend the day. Okay. because there's no school at this time. There's no control. My parents, my father worked at the hospital. My mother stayed at home. Of course, my older brothers and sisters I had nothing to do with. And I mainly spent time outside of my block environment and another block with friends that we made. I felt that, yeah, this is wrong, but I wasn't really affected by it. I thought it was going to be a big adventure because I knew we were going to leave. We're going somewhere, and it's going to be different. But I really didn't feel that. I knew there was something wrong, but I didn't feel badly about the whole situation. In fact, I had told someone else the same story about being in the camp at 13 and 14. I was in there about a year and a half, so it was about 14 when we left. That was one of the one of the most interesting times of my life, because I had no parents that could control me, tell me what to do. I had no responsibilities. I could do anything I wanted to. I could eat wherever I wanted to. I didn't have to come home. And so they lost total control over me. But I wasn't a bad child. I mean, they knew I couldn't go anywhere. And I'd always come back to sleep. But I would leave the morning after I did whatever chores they wanted me to do. And I'd be gone all day long. And so, to me, it was a different situation. We, of course, had no bicycles, no cars, or anything like that. We walked, but being 13, 14 is not a problem. Yeah, like I had an older sister who was at Berkeley at the time, and she had a boyfriend, and he had a car, and he was going to Caltech. And of course they said, no, they're not going to a camp. And so they took off. They decided they're going to go east. You could go east, you could leave. And so they left they ended up in Chicago. But they were not going to a camp. And she said, no, this is wrong. We're not going. My older brother, when did he get married? In November of 1941, and he was living with his in-laws and his wife, and he was going to Caltech also. And of course, this evacuation, he couldn't leave. He had no place to go, but he was in school, and he was working on his master's degree in chemistry. And it interrupted his whole life. And so his schooling was interrupted, and he went to Tulare with his in-law family, and but then applied with the help of his professor for graduate school back east. It was accepted, and so he left Tulare camp and went to the Midwest for schooling, and then his wife followed him later. Yeah, their whole life was totally interrupted. But see, I didn't have that problem. I can tell you exactly what happened because there was a riot.
Okay.
Okay, And this happened to be over what some of the committee people thought that the administration was hoarding or keeping some of the sugar and other foods. And so a lot of it, well, not a lot, but a number of camp people got upset and they demonstrated. And they went down to the administration building and went there to demonstrate. And so, of course, the camp has barbed wire and guard towers and armed sentries. And also, where the Alabama Hills, there's a contingent of soldiers there. They brought them in, and at that day, since there's this demonstration, and allegedly a riot, but it was a demonstration, they lined up, and I can tell you this from firsthand because I saw it. And we were playing football in the sand, but we knew there's something going on. Mm-hmm. And so we went down there, and yeah, the sentries are lined up with bayonets and guns, rifles, and there are people milling around. And that evening and that night, the guards opened fire on the people that were down there, demonstrators, and of course they all scattered and ran. And I think there are two that were killed. One I think died later in the hospital. But the one that was killed, the boy, he was from Pasadena, and actually I knew him, and it was Frank Ito, and we called him Popeye because he had one funny eye, like Popeye had. And he was shot in the back because he was running away, and he was killed. And I personally knew him. And he lived in Pasadena, not too far from where we lived, and he was the nicest guy. He wasn't there to cause any problems. He was there as an onlooker, and unfortunately he was shot and he was killed. But that night, all during that evening after the riot, after the demonstration and the crowd was fired upon, there were riots, internal riots among the internees. And one group was after some of the other internees because they thought they were what they called dogs, inus, and that they were siding with the administration. And I think there was somebody had been imprisoned in jail for some activity, and they're trying to get him out. But anyway, all that night there were people running around and attacking other people that they thought were collaborators with the administration. And I could hear ambulances that night, and people running around shouting and screaming in various areas. But we stayed indoors. I was inside. So that was the riot that occurred in Manzanar. It had to do with what some internees thought that the administration was responsible for interning or imprisoning some of their leaders or whatever. But anyway, that was the riot that occurred there. It should be.
Yeah.
People were imprisoned in these camps without a trial.
Yeah.
Right? And that's imprisoning people who were citizens. Okay, now, of course, my parents were not citizens, because they couldn't become citizens. They couldn't become naturalized citizens by law at that time. But that's taking American citizens who were born here and rounding them up and putting them in prison.
Yeah.
And yes, the proper way, of course, is if you're going to imprison somebody, you give them a trial and determine if they're guilty of anything. So it took 110,000 people, rounded them up, took them out of their homes, and put them into a prison.
Yeah.
Without any trial and without any real good reason. And that's, of course, unconstitutional. Another part of this whole thing that people really aren't aware of, besides the 10 camps and 110,000 people being rounded up and put into these camps, they're about in Peru. They're in Peru, the country of Peru. There were Japanese immigrants who lived there and worked there, and whether you're farming or whatever, they had come from Japan to Peru, and there are something like 2,000 what we call Peruvian Japanese people. Whether how long they lived there, 10 years, 15 years, but anyway, they're Peruvians. And the U.S. government had convinced the Peruvian government to extradite those Peruvians to the U.S. to be put in these camps. So about 2,000 actual Peruvians of Japanese ancestry that were imprisoned in the U.S. for no good reason.
Yeah.
And that was really tragic because it had nothing to do with the U.S. They convinced the Peruvian government, I guess because they thought it was South America, maybe the strategic area on the West Coast. And those people were not compensated anything. They just lost everything. They had to come here from Peru. Yeah, people feel that way, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm.
People feel that way.
Yeah.
They've never experienced it. And
Mm-hmm.
like taking them and putting them into a camp, see how they like it.
Yeah, lose everything. And...
Yeah, people lost a lot, Fortunately, we had we had a house, but fortunately, we had somebody that took care of it and rented it out, actually, for my mother and father, and they sold it later. But other people...
Yeah, they just had to
lost
leave.
everything. I mean, people that had fishing boats in Terminal Island, where there's a community of fishermen, they had to get out in 24 hours, like 3 months, 4 months repair in Pasadena. Terminal Island, they had 24 hours to get out, and that meant they lost everything. And all they could take was whatever they could carry. So they had fishing boats, cars, houses, furniture. They had to leave. And that's disastrous because in 24 hours you really can't find it. Because, Terminal Island was sort of a Navy base at the time and it was considered strategic. But yeah. We were compensated $20,000. and that was fought for over redress. And yeah, $20,000. I got $20,000. If you're alive,
You got
if you're living, you got the money.
your
But of
parents
course,
were
by
dead.
the time that was appropriated, the older people already died. The people that suffered the most,
Yeah.
the parents were dead. They got nothing. How old was I when I got that? That was about, when was that?
What year was that?
That was during
Clinton?
Reagan's administration, so yeah. I was probably in my 50s.
Oh wow. Yeah.
Yeah, to me, but that was a redress that they had to go to court and whatnot, and finally got that money appropriated. But a large majority of the people that really suffered, the mothers and fathers and the older people, got nothing because they had to be living to get it.
Yeah.
And of course that didn't compensate people for what they really lost. It was a token.